I drove out to my late wife's mill and orchard, only to find 15 vehicles packing the property. My son and his in-laws were throwing a massive, unauthorized commercial gala. My daughter-in-law's father just smirked and said it plain, "It's going to be family property soon enough." I didn't utter a single word. Sitting motionless in my truck with crucial files in hand, I placed one cold, decisive call. A few hours later, their smug smiles vanished, replaced by sheer terror and disbelief as their entire world crumbled around them. Thank you for being here truly. Now tell me something, what city or country are you joining us from today? Let's see how far wise revenge reaches around the world. Leave it in the comments, I want to know. Note some details in this story are fictional, added for storytelling purposes. Names and settings are not drawn from real life, but the lesson waiting for you at the end absolutely is. I have been a structural and fire safety engineer for 38 years, and the one thing that profession drills into you deeper than any textbook, deeper than any licensing exam, is that small damage never stays small. A hairline crack in a load-bearing wall in October becomes a structural failure by February. Not because the building is trying to hurt you, because physics does not care about your schedule. I retired 3 years ago. My name is Orson Braithwaite. I am 68 years old and I live alone on the eastern edge of Ravalli County, Montana, in a house that feels the right size in summer and about twice too large every November when the first hard freeze comes in off the mountains. My wife Marcella passed 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end, which the doctors called fast, and which I would call something else entirely if I had a word for it. She was 63 years old, and she had the kind of laugh that made strangers in grocery stores turn around and smile without knowing why. She was also the one who built the old Braithwaite mill and orchard. Not built it the way people say, built it, when they mean they hired someone. Built it with her actual hands alongside me and our friend Dale Hutchins on 4 acres of scrubland outside of town that she spotted in 1994 and said we were buying before I had even looked at the price. The orchard came first. Heirloom apple trees she sourced from a nursery in Oregon, planted by hand, every single one. The workshop came second. And the centerpiece of that workshop was a century-old woodworking saw bench she found in a second-hand shop in Missoula in 1987, 7 years before we even had a workshop to put it in. I asked her why she was buying a 100-year-old saw bench when we lived in a 2-bedroom apartment. She ran her hand along the grain of the wood and said, "Orson, this needs to come home with us." I did not understand that at the time. I understand it now. The Wednesday before Thanksgiving, I was stacking a crate of heirloom apples in the bed of my truck. I planned to drive them out to the mill the next morning, the way I had every Thanksgiving since Marcella passed, just to be there, just to be near the place she loved when my phone rang. It was Petra Hollis, my neighbor, whose property ran along the north fence of the orchard. "Orson." Her voice carried that particular tone, not quite alarm, closer to the kind of puzzled concern you get from someone who has lived next to open land long enough to know when something is off. "There have been vehicles going in and out of your gate since noon. I counted at least 5. Big ones. You expecting somebody out there?" My chest tightened before my brain had fully caught up. "No," I said. "I'm not expecting anyone. I drove out that evening. The gate code I had used for 6 years did not work. I tried it twice, standing in the cold, with my truck idling, and both times the keypad blinked red. Through the iron bars, I could see lights on inside the workshop that should have been empty and dark. I did not get out of the truck. I took photographs through the windshield, wrote down the time on my phone, and drove home. Then I called Cassian Thorpe. Cassian has been my chess partner for 30 years and my attorney for 25. He is 67 years old, and he speaks the way a man speaks. When he has spent 30 years making words do the work that facts require, nothing borrowed, nothing wasted. I told him what Petra had said and what I had seen. When I finished, he was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Don't go back tonight, he said, and don't call Garrett yet. I'll pull the county public records first thing tomorrow morning. Any filings tied to that property address in the last 6 months. You think there are filings? I think a changed gate code and lights in an empty building is not a coincidence, he said. I think someone has been planning something, and I think you should have your deed and your trust documents in a folder before you do anything else. I went to my filing cabinet after we hung up. Sole ownership deed, living trust, property insurance. I set them on the kitchen table and looked at them for a moment. An hour later, my son Garrett called. His voice was smooth, the particular smoothness of someone who has rehearsed. Hey, Dad. Just wanted to let you know we're actually going to spend Thanksgiving over in Idaho this year at Kendall's parents' place. You'll be okay on your own, right? Don't go driving too far by yourself. Something pulled tight behind my sternum, not anger, yet something colder and more specific. After 33 years of knowing my son's voice, I could hear the rehearsal in it. I could hear the careful, casual. Drive safe, I said. I hung up and looked at the heirloom apple crate sitting on my kitchen counter, packed and ready for a morning drive I still intended to make. Then I looked at the folder of documents on the table. I have driven that road to the mill more times than I can count. Every bend, every frost heave in the asphalt, every spot where the tree line breaks and the valley opens up, I know them the way you know a route you have traveled with someone you loved. Marcella used to say the last half mile felt like the land was exhaling. I never found a better description. Thanksgiving morning, I loaded the apple crate into the passenger seat, set my folder of documents on top, and pulled out of the driveway before 7. The sky was that particular shade of pale gray that Montana does in late November, not threatening, just honest. Cold and clear and indifferent. I turned onto the access road and drove the last quarter mile through the pines. Then I came around the bend and stopped the truck. I counted 15 vehicles. Not 5 the way Petra had described Wednesday. 15. Pickup trucks, SUVs, one black sedan that still had dealership shine on it. They were parked across the grass in rows that somebody had clearly planned out. This was not a crowd that had arrived and improvised. And there in the space closest to the gate, parked in the position you give to the guest of honor, or the man who believes he is running things, was a dark blue Ford that I recognized immediately. My son's truck. The chest tightening I had felt Wednesday night came back, but harder this time, the way a load bears differently once you know where the weak point is. I made myself keep looking. I made myself inventory what I was seeing the way I had inventoried thousands of job sites over 38 years. Do not react. Observe first. A white vinyl banner had been stretched across the entrance posts. The posts Marcella and I had set in the ground ourselves in 1997. The banner was printed in large block letters, the kind of printing that costs real money and takes 2 weeks to arrive. Vanivort Autumn Harvest Gala. The sign Marcella had made for the gate, hand-painted wood, her name and the orchard's name in her careful lettering, was gone. In its place, a new panel of laser-cut cedar read, "The Vanivort Heritage Barn." My jaw tightened so hard my back teeth ached. A man I recognized as a private security guard stood at the gate in a branded jacket, checking something on a clipboard. He was scanning guests as they arrived, the kind of scanning you do when people have purchased tickets, and you are verifying their names against a list. This was not a family gathering. This was a ticketed commercial event. On my land. Without my knowledge. Without my permission. Across the yard, Garrick Vanivort stood in the center of the grass, like he had been standing in centers of things his whole life. He was 65 years old, heavy-set, wearing a sport coat over a flannel shirt, in the way of a man who wanted to look both prosperous and approachable at the same time. He was shaking hands and laughing, his head thrown back, his voice carrying across the yard, even from where I sat. Beside him, Lavinia Vanavort moved through the guests in a red dress, her smile so fixed and practiced, it looked like something she had put on with her earrings. I had known these people for 7 years. I had sat across from them at birthday dinners and holiday tables and a wedding, and standing in my yard under a banner with their name on it on my property, they looked completely at home. That was the part that hit hardest. Not the anger, the ease. I looked at the cedar sign one more time. The Vanavort Heritage Barn. Someone had designed that. Someone had ordered it, paid for it, waited for it to be made and shipped and installed. That sign did not go up this morning. That sign had been planned for weeks. I pulled my phone from the cup holder and called Deputy Brenda Callahan. She picked up on the second ring. I kept my voice level. 68 years had been sufficient practice. Brenda, I said. This is Orson Braithwaite out on the Quarry Point Access Road. I need you to come to my property. I am sitting in my truck at the bottom of my drive. There are 15 vehicles on my land, a commercial event in progress, and a security guard checking tickets at my gate. I have not given anyone permission to be here. I have my deed in my hand. A beat of quiet on her end. Then, I'll be there in 15 minutes, Orson. You stay in that truck. Already planned on it, I said. I set the phone on the seat beside my folder and looked through the windshield at the banner stretched across my wife's gateposts. A man who arrives prepared does not need to raise his voice. But I will tell you, honestly, it took everything I had sitting in that truck, watching strangers laugh on Marcella's grass, to keep mine from shaking. 15 minutes is a long time to sit in a truck and watch people enjoy themselves on your land. I used every one of those minutes. First, I tried the gate code again, not because I expected it to work, but because I needed it on record that I had tried. The keypad blinked red. I photographed it. Then I opened the timestamp app on my phone and began documenting everything I could see from the driver's seat. The banner, the vehicles, the security guard's jacket logo, the approximate number of guests visible in the yard. Every photo had a timestamp. Every note had a timestamp. 38 years of writing inspection reports had made that reflex as automatic as breathing. Then I opened the property management application I had installed when I upgraded the gate system in 2019. It was a straightforward piece of software, the kind that lets a property owner monitor access, remotely check battery levels on the locks, and review the history of every code that had ever been created or used. I had registered it under my name as sole account holder the day I set it up. It had been sitting quietly on my phone for 4 years, doing nothing interesting. I had turned off push notifications months earlier. The motion sensors triggered too often in wind, and the constant alerts had become noise I stopped listening to. Without the alerts pushing to my screen, I had not once opened the app to manually review the footage since August. The recordings had been accumulating in silence. That habit I would later consider one of my more expensive oversights. I had not opened the footage viewer manually. Once since August, there had been nothing to look for, and a man does not review tape when he has no reason to suspect there is anything on it. Until now. I pulled up the access history. I scrolled 2 lines further. At 5:22, 5 minutes after the new code was created, my original access code had been deleted from the system. That was why the keypad blinked red when I tried it Wednesday night. My own code on my own property removed from the inside. I sat with that information for a moment. My son had given Garrick Vanavort a code to my gate. Not just access, a freshly created code generated 2 days before Thanksgiving, shared deliberately to a man whose initials told me everything I needed to know about who was standing in my yard right now. My hands tightened on the phone hard enough that my knuckles went pale. Not from surprise, from the specific bone-deep disappointment of having your worst suspicion confirmed by your own child's name on a screen. I took a screenshot. I emailed it to Cassian before I did anything else. Then I called him. He picked up before the second ring. "I saw it," he said, which told me he had been watching his inbox. "I'm already on my way. Orson, I need you to stay in that truck until Callahan gets there. Do not engage with anyone in that yard." A pause. "The property camera system, is it still running?" "Continuously," I said. 30-day rolling storage." "Don't touch anything on that app until I'm standing next to you," he said. "I know," I said. "I mean it. Not Garrick. Not Garrett. Nobody. You are the property owner arriving to find unauthorized individuals on your land. That is the only role you play until a badge is standing next to you. Cassian." My voice came out steadier than I felt. "I have been doing this longer than you have. I know how first contact works." A short exhale on his end, not quite a laugh, but close. "I know you do. I'll be there within the hour. I have something else you need to see, but it keeps until I'm standing next to you." We hung up. I looked back at the yard. Garrick was shaking hands near the grill area, his voice carrying across the yard, with the ease of a man who had already decided the outcome of the afternoon. A group of guests had gathered around the grill area where my equipment should have been stored, holding drinks, faces relaxed and warm. One woman in a camel coat was pointing up at the workshop roofline, saying something to the man beside her, and he was nodding appreciatively. They were admiring my wife's building. Something burned low in my chest. Not anger exactly, more like the feeling you get when you realize a structural failure you could have caught 6 months ago has been sitting there the whole time, growing quietly while you weren't looking. Deputy Brenda Callahan's cruiser came around the bend, without lights, without sirens, exactly the way I had asked. She was 45 years old, lean with the kind of deliberate calm that told you she had seen enough situations unravel to know that urgency was not the same as speed. She pulled up alongside my truck and lowered her window. "Orson." Her eyes moved past me to the yard, taking inventory the same way I had. "How many?" 15 vehicles. I'd estimate 60 guests. One private security contractor at the gate. I held up my folder. "I have the deed. I have the trust documents. And I have a screenshot showing my son created a new gate code Wednesday afternoon and shared it to Garrick Vanavort." Callahan looked at the banner. She looked at the security guard. She looked back at me with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite satisfaction. The expression of someone who has just understood exactly what kind of afternoon this is going to be. "All right," she said. "Let's go talk to some people." She got out of her cruiser. I got out of my truck. I tucked the folder under my arm the way I had carried inspection reports onto 1,000 job sites, and I walked up the drive toward my own gate. Callahan fell into step beside me as we walked up the drive, her hand resting near her belt, her eyes already reading the yard. Garrick Vanavort saw us before we reached the gate. I watched the moment register on his face, the slight recalibration behind his eyes, the half-second where the laugh died and the performance took over. Then the arms went wide and the smile came back bigger than before, the kind of smile that is really just teeth pointed at a problem. "Orson." He crossed the yard toward us with the stride of a man who had decided confidence was the same as authority. "And Brenda, good to see you. Come on in, come on in. This is just a little family celebration, nothing to worry about." Deputy Callahan did not smile back. She had the particular stillness of someone who had heard the words, "nothing to worry about," directly, before things became very worrying, and she had learned to treat the phrase accordingly. "Mr. Vanavort," she said, "are you the owner of this property?" Garrick laughed a warm, generous sound, the laugh of a man who believes charm is a legal defense. "Well, it's going to be family property soon enough. My son-in-law, Mr. Vanavort." Callahan's voice did not rise. It simply stopped him. "Are you the owner of this property? Yes or no?" I opened my folder and handed her the deed without a word. She took it, read it, and turned it so the text faced Garrick. "This property is titled solely to Orson James Braithwaite," she said. "Garrett Braithwaite holds no ownership interest of any kind. Is that your understanding?" The generous laugh flickered. Garrick's eyes moved to me, not quite a glare, not quite a plea, somewhere in the uncomfortable middle ground of a man who had expected a different conversation. "Now, Orson, there's no need to make this into something it isn't. We're all family here." My jaw tightened. "There is one name on that deed," I said. "It is not Vanavort, and it is not your son-in-law's. Everyone on this property without my written permission is trespassing. That includes you." From the porch steps, Lavinia Vanavort descended with the careful dignity of a woman who had planned her entrance. She was wearing a red dress that cost more than my first truck, and her smile was the kind that stays in place regardless of what is happening behind it. She touched Callahan's arm lightly, the gesture of a woman accustomed to managing situations through warmth. "Deputy, I'm sure we can sort this out," Lavinia said, her voice honeyed and smooth. "This is a misunderstanding between family members. Surely you don't need to be involved in, ma'am." Callahan stepped back just enough to remove her arm from contact. "I'm going to need everyone at this event to remain on the property while we establish the facts. Nobody leaves until I say so." Lavinia's smile stayed fixed, but something shifted behind her eyes, the first crack in the performance. Callahan turned to me with 3 questions delivered in the flat official tone that meant they were going into a report. "Mr. Braithwaite, did you give any individual here permission to be on this property today?" "No." "Did you provide anyone with a gate code or access credential?" "No." "Did you authorize this gathering in any form, verbal, written, or otherwise?" "No." Each answer landed in the yard like something solid dropping onto concrete. Around us, heads were turning. The music was still playing. Someone had not yet understood that the afternoon had changed, and the contrast of it, cheerful background noise against the official silence between Callahan and Garrick, was almost absurd. Callahan turned to the security guard at the gate. "Sir, I need you to cut the music and ask every guest to remain where they are." The guard looked at Garrick. Garrick gave a small, tight nod that cost him something. The music stopped. 60 people in their Thanksgiving finest stood in my wife's yard and looked toward the gate. I scanned the crowd until I found him, Garrett, standing near the far edge of the orchard, his face the color of January sky. His eyes met mine across the yard, and then dropped immediately to the ground, like a man who had looked directly at something he could not take back. My chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with Garrick Vanavort. Then I saw Garrick reach into the inside pocket of his sport coat and produce a folded document. He smoothed it against his palm and placed it on the hood of Callahan's cruiser with the careful precision of a man playing what he believed was his winning hand. "I think," he said, his voice recovering some of its earlier warmth, "that this will clarify the situation considerably." The document was 5 pages long, printed on heavy stock, with a notary seal on the final page and Garrett's signature above it in blue ink. Garrick stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching Callahan read it with the expression of a man who has just laid down 4 aces and is waiting for the table to acknowledge it. Callahan read every page. She did not rush. When she finished, she looked up at me. Mr. Braithwaite, this is a 5-year lease agreement for the property signed by Garrett Braithwaite as the lessor and Garrick Vanavort as the lessee, executed in September. I see that, I said. I'd like you to read me the name of the lessor again. Garrett Braithwaite. And the name on the deed you're holding? Orson James Braithwaite. I turned to face Garrick directly. My son does not own this property. He has never owned this property. He has no legal interest in this land, not 1 acre, not 1 square foot, not 1 inch. A man cannot lease what he does not own. That contract is void ab initio void from the moment it was signed, as though it never existed. Garrick's jaw tightened. The 4 aces were gone, and he knew it, but he was not the kind of man who conceded quickly. Now Orson Garrett is your son. He acts on your behalf. He does not. My voice came out flat and certain the way it used to sound when I was signing off on a failed inspection. He has never had power of attorney over this property. He has never had written authorization to enter into any agreement on my behalf. I want that stated clearly for the record, Deputy. Callahan was already writing. Noted. Then Garrett stepped forward. He had been standing at the edge of the small crowd that had gathered near the gate guests, who had drifted closer when the music stopped, drawn by the particular human instinct to watch a situation unravel. My son was 33 years old, and he looked younger than that right now, his face tight, with something caught between guilt and the desperate hope that this could still somehow be walked back. Dad. His voice cracked on the single syllable. I can explain just down to Garrett. I kept my voice low, but I held up one hand. Not right now. I didn't know he was going to do all of this. He said he just wanted to use the space for a family, Garrett. Firmer this time. The way I had said his name when he was 9 years old and had broken something he knew he shouldn't have touched. I said not right now. His mouth closed. His eyes went red at the rims, and he pressed his lips together hard, the way a man does when he is fighting to keep his composure in public and losing the fight by inches. He took a step back. His hands were shaking. I could see it from 6 feet away, the fine tremor of someone whose body had decided to express what his voice was not allowed to. Garrick watched his son-in-law retreat and recalibrated quickly. He spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. Orson, look. We can discuss the legal fine print another time. Today is Thanksgiving. These people came a long way. Mr. Vanavort. Callahan's voice had the quality of a door closing. The contract is legally void, as Mr. Braithwaite has described. You have no authorized claim to this property. I need you to understand that what I'm looking at right now is a criminal trespass situation, and I need you to start thinking carefully about how you'd like to proceed. The word criminal landed in the yard like a stone into still water. I watched it ripple outward through the crowd, saw shoulders stiffen, saw a woman in a camel coat reach for her husband's arm, saw 2 men near the grill exchange a quick look that said, "We need to find out how close the parking lot is." Garrick's mouth thinned. The warmth dropped out of his face for just a moment, not long, but long enough. He looked at me the way men look at each other when the social contract has broken down, and they are trying to calculate what comes next. "You're really going to do this," he said. Not a question. A recalibration. "Mr. Vanavort, I said I was doing this before you got here." Callahan walked the perimeter of the yard, while her second unit handled the guests. I asked her to let me check the workshop first. As the property owner, I needed to document the interior condition before anything else was moved or touched. She agreed and came with me. I had not been inside the workshop since August. I knew that the moment I stepped through the door because the smell was wrong. Marcella's workshop had a particular smell, raw timber linseed oil, the faint mineral edge of the stone floor she had laid herself in the summer of 2001. 20 years of woodworking had soaked into the walls of that building. You could not replicate it, and you could not mistake it. What I smelled now was catering. Warm bread and roasted meat, and the waxy sweetness of those tall pillar candles that event companies use because they photograph well. The walls were hung with burlap and fairy lights. Round tables with white linen filled the center of the floor, where Marcella's workbenches used to stand. The workbenches had been pushed to the far wall and stacked against each other without padding or protection. The way people move things when they do not care what happens to them. The tool racks were bare. The pegboard where she had kept her hand, planes and chisels, empty hooks still in place, nothing on them. I moved through the space the way I moved through every compromised structure I had ever inspected, methodically. Starting at the entrance and working clockwise, noting each point of damage or alteration in my phone. Callahan followed without speaking, which was exactly what I needed from her. Then I reached the back corner of the room. The saw bench was there. I want to be careful about how I describe what I felt when I saw it, because I am not a man who exaggerates damage. In 38 years of inspections, I have seen buildings that should have been condemned and written the report in the same flat, professional language I used for everything else. Emotion does not improve a damage assessment. It only obscures it. But I am going to tell you that when I saw what they had done to Marcella's saw bench, something happened in my chest that I have not felt since the morning after she died. A grief so specific and so sudden that it moved through me like a current. The bench had been there since 1987, 100 years old when she bought it. Hand-cut dovetail joints, tiger maple top, worn smooth by generations of use, 4 legs turned on a lathe by someone who understood that a tool could also be a beautiful thing. Marcella had refinished it 3 times over the years, always to the same honey amber color, always with the same patient care she gave everything she loved. The 4 legs had been sawed off at the knee, cut down to counter height, so the surface could serve as a buffet table. Stainless steel chafing dish brackets had been bolted through the top. The tiger maple was scarred with ring stains from serving trays, and along the near edge someone had gouged a channel to run an extension cord. 100 years. Sawed off at the knee for a buffet table. I stood there and I breathed through my nose for a moment, because that was the only thing I trusted myself to do. Then I called Dale Hutchins. He answered on the second ring. Dale was 70 years old and had been a Finnish carpenter for 45 of them. He had helped Marcella bring the saw bench home from Missoula in his truck. He had been the one to refinish it the last time 2 years before she got sick. "Would Dale," I said, "I need you at the mill, right now. Don't ask me anything until you get here." He heard something in my voice that made him not ask. 20 minutes, he said, and hung up. While we waited, I photographed everything. Every bolt hole, every saw cut, every ring stain. Callahan photographed alongside me and added her own notes to her report. We did not speak much. There was not much to say that the photographs did not already say better. Dale arrived in 19 minutes. I heard his truck on the gravel and met him at the door. He stepped it inside and stopped walking. His eyes went to the saw bench and stayed there. Dale Hutchins had built furniture for 45 years, and he understood what a piece of wood could be. He stood in the doorway of that workshop and looked at what remained of Marcella's bench, and his face did something I had only seen it do once before, at her funeral. He pressed his hand flat against the doorframe to steady himself. His voice, when it came, was barely above a breath. "Oh, Marcella." I turned away and looked at the wall. My eyes burned and my throat locked, and I stood there looking at a bare hook on an empty pegboard until I had myself back. Then I turned to Callahan. My voice came out level. I needed it to be level. I need you to add to the report, I said. One antique saw bench, approximately 1920 manufacture tiger maple construction. 4 legs cut down top surface, drilled and scarred. Estimated restoration value. I stopped. Dale, give me a number. Dale pulled his hand from the doorframe. He cleared his throat hard twice. 15,000, he said. If we can find the right wood. If. I wrote it down. Then I walked out of the workshop and into the yard where Garrick Vanavort was standing near the gate with his arms crossed, watching me with the careful expression of a man who was still trying to decide what posture served him best. I walked up to him, and I said quietly enough that only he could hear it. You just did something that cannot be fixed with a check. Garrick did not answer me. He looked at me with that recalculating expression, and then looked away, which was answer enough. I left him standing there and walked back toward Callahan's position near the center of the yard, where her second unit was working through the guests in small clusters, taking names, asking questions, doing the patient administrative work that turns a situation into a record. I found Callahan with a couple in their mid-50s, the man in a sport coat, the woman in a wool dress the color of burgundy wine. They had the look of people who had arrived expecting a pleasant afternoon and were now trying very hard to seem cooperative rather than alarmed. We purchased tickets online, the man was saying. 2 tickets, $150 each. We transferred the payment through an app. Callahan looked up at me, then back at him. Which app? The man produced his phone and pulled up his transaction history. He turned the screen toward Callahan. I leaned in far enough to read the account name Kendall VB Events LLC. The date of transfer was 11 days ago. The memo line read, Vanavort Harvest Gala General Admission X2. I need you to keep that screen up, Callahan told the man. I'll be back to photograph it in a moment. She stepped aside with me, lowering her voice. That's a registered business account. I ran it while you were in the storage building. Kendall VB Events LLC filed with the Montana Secretary of State 8 months ago. Active entity. It is, I said. And the business is operating on private property without authorization, which means every dollar that went through that account is revenue from an illegal commercial venture. Before Callahan could respond, Kendall Vanavort Braithwaite appeared from the direction of the workshop door. She was 30 years old, dark-haired, wearing a cream blazer that looked like it had been chosen for exactly this kind of event, polished without being ostentatious. She moved with the confidence of someone who had been managing other people's impressions for a long time. Deputy. Her voice was smooth and direct. I think there's been a misunderstanding about the nature of this gathering. This is a private family event. The ticketing system was just a way to coordinate RSVPs. Ma'am, Callahan said, $150 per person is not an RSVP fee. Kendall's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Her eyes moved to me with a look I had seen before, the look people give a building inspector when they realize the inspection is not going to go their way and they are calculating how much that is going to cost them. Mr. Braithwaite, she said, her voice dropping half a register, I hope you understand what you're doing to this family. I understand it precisely, I said. Excuse me. I walked away from her toward the far side of the yard, near the storage building that ran alongside the north fence. I pulled out my phone and opened the side door. The propane tanks were stacked 4 rows deep along the interior wall. I counted them as I moved down the row, touching each one 51 tanks in total, the large commercial size, the kind that feed event-grade grills and outdoor heaters. They were standing upright in an enclosed space with no mechanical ventilation, no secondary containment, no separation distances. The damp heat from the cooking equipment outside had raised the interior temperature significantly. This qualified. The condition had been created without my knowledge or consent. The storage building had been locked and empty the last time I set foot on this property in August. I made sure Callahan noted that in her report before I made the calls. The first call was to Roy Stemple. Roy had been with the Ravalli County Utility Authority for 22 years, and I had worked alongside him on enough commercial inspections that I did not need to explain myself in stages. I said, I'm at the Braithwaite Mill on Quarry Point Road. I am the sole account holder on this property's utility service, and I am requesting an immediate disconnect on electrical and water. Unauthorized individuals are operating commercial equipment on my property without my consent, and I need the service terminated. A brief pause. You're the account holder. Sole account holder. My name is the only name on the service agreement. Give me 13 minutes, Roy said. The second call was to the Montana State Fire Marshal's office emergency line. I gave them the address, my credentials, and told them what I had found: 51 commercial propane cylinders in an unventilated enclosed space, 12 unlicensed aerial mortar tubes stored alongside them, interior temperature running significantly above ambient for at least 4 hours. They told me to keep the building secured and that an inspector would be on site within the hour. I stepped back outside, locked the storage building, and walked past Kendall without stopping. What did you just do? She called after me, her voice climbing. My job, I said. The one I did for 38 years. 13 minutes. I looked at my watch and counted down. It happened at exactly 13 minutes. One moment, the yard was full of warm light, and the smell of roasting meat, and the low hum of a generator running the catering equipment. The next moment, nothing. Every string light went dark simultaneously. The heating lamps around the perimeter died. The chafing dishes on the buffet tables lost their flame. From inside the workshop, there was a sharp electronic chirp as the sound system lost power, and then the entire property settled into the kind of quiet that feels loud after noise. From somewhere near the back of the crowd, Lavinia Vanavort let out a cry that started as surprise and finished as outrage. A sound that carried the specific indignation of a woman whose carefully arranged afternoon had just been dismantled by someone else's phone call. What happened? She demanded, spinning toward her husband. Garrick, what is happening? Garrick's face had gone the color of old concrete. He looked at me across the darkened yard and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. He knew exactly what had happened. He just had not believed I would do it. I walked back to where Callahan was standing. Fire marshal is on the way, I told her. Storage building is secured. I've documented everything, it's in my photos. Callahan looked at the darkened workshop, at the guests standing in confused clusters, at the catering staff staring helplessly at equipment that would not turn back on. I'll note it in the report, she said. That was when Kendall came at me in earnest. She crossed the yard with the kind of focused energy that told me she had been building up to this since the moment Callahan arrived. Her cream blazer was still perfect. Her voice was not. His mother told Garrett this property would come to him. She planted herself 3 feet in front of me, chin up, jaw set, eyes hot with the specific fury of someone who has been counting on an inheritance for years. Marcella said it herself. We have witnesses. Something straightened in my spine. His mother, I said carefully, was my wife. Kendall did not flinch. She promised Garrett the mill. Everyone at the family dinner in 2019 heard her say it. I reached into my folder. I had carried that folder all day, and every document in it had been waiting for its moment. I found the one I wanted and handed it to Callahan without looking away from Kendall. "This is the Braithwaite Family Living Trust," I said, executed in September of 2021 and notarized by a Ravalli County notary public. The mill, the orchard, and all associated structures were placed into that trust at the time of execution. I am the sole trustee. No transfer, lease, commercial use, or conveyance of any kind can occur without written authorization from me in my capacity as trustee. I paused. A verbal statement at a family dinner has no legal standing against a notarized trust document. Not in Montana. Not anywhere. Kendall's mouth opened. Then it closed. The fury in her eyes did not disappear. It compressed the way pressure compresses when a valve is closed, looking for somewhere else to go. "You planned this," she said. Her voice had dropped to something quieter and more dangerous. "You set all of this up years ago." "I set it up to protect my wife's legacy," I said. "What you did with the time in between is your own business." From the far edge of the yard, Garrett stepped forward. His face was stripped of everything now: the guilt, the calculation, the desperate hope that things might still resolve themselves. What was left underneath was something raw. He looked at his wife, then at his father-in-law, then at me. "Dad." His voice broke in the middle of the word, cracked clean through like green wood under pressure. "I didn't know about the trust. I swear I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said. That stopped him. He had expected anger. I could see it in the way he had braced his shoulders, the way his hands had curled at his sides, ready to absorb a blow. My agreement undid him more than anger would have. His eyes went red and wet, and he pressed the back of his hand hard against his mouth. Before anyone could say anything further, my phone buzzed. A message from Cassian, in the parking area. "Come to me when you can. I have the county filing." I looked up at Callahan. "There's something else," I said. "Something that changes the scope of what we're looking at." Cassian Thorpe was leaning against the hood of his car, at the edge of the parking area, a document folder under one arm and a look on his face that I had learned over 30 years of chess games meant he had found something serious. Cassian had the particular focus of a man who has just had a theory confirmed. He had never once told me what I wanted to hear when the truth was something different. This morning was not going to be the exception. "Before I show you the filing," he said without preamble, "I need to ask you something. The security camera system you installed in 2020, is it still running?" "It runs continuously," I said. "Continuous feed. 30-day archive rolling." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, Cassian did not surprise easily, but the particular focus of a man who has just had a theory confirmed. "Open the app," he said. I pulled out my phone and opened the property camera application. The system had 4 cameras, 2 covering the workshop exterior, 1 on the storage building, 1 on the orchard gate. Cassian had asked specifically about the workshop feed, so I pulled that one up and handed him the phone. He scrolled back 3 weeks without being asked. November 12th, 6:58 in the morning. The workshop exterior camera showed my son's truck pulling through the orchard gate in the gray pre-dawn light. A second vehicle followed, a dark SUV I recognized as Garrick's. He had parked it in my driveway at every family dinner for 7 years. A man learns another man's vehicle the way he learns his handwriting without trying to. Both vehicles parked near the workshop side entrance. Then Garrett got out, unlocked the workshop with his key. A key I had given him years ago when Marcella was still alive, and he used to come out on weekends to help her, and held the door open. I had never changed that lock after she died. It had not once occurred to me that I needed to. What came out of that workshop over the next 4 hours was my equipment. My commercial table saw, my industrial planer, my CNC router, a machine I had spent 11 months saving for purchased the year before Marcella got sick. My pneumatic tool set. 4 rolling equipment cabinets. They worked methodically and without hurry, loading each piece into the bed of Garrett's truck or the cargo area of Garrick's SUV. 2 men with a clear plan and no apparent concern about the camera mounted 12 feet above their heads because they did not know it was there. I watched $45,000 of equipment leave my workshop in 4 hours of footage. My hands tightened around the phone until the edges bit into my palm. "I have the equipment's location," Cassian said quietly. "Garrick has a storage unit in Missoula. I have the address." He had hired an investigator the moment he saw my screenshot Wednesday night. The man had spent Thursday and Friday running down leads storage units registered to Vanavort Property Holdings rental agreements in Garrick's name, commercial units, large enough to hold the equipment I had described. By Saturday morning, he had the address. That was exactly the kind of thing Cassian Thorpe did when he decided a situation was serious. I stood there for a moment, breathing through the anger, because anger was not what this situation needed from me right now. What it needed was the same thing every compromised structure needed: a clear assessment and a documented response. I walked back to where Callahan was standing near the gate and showed her the footage without speaking. She watched the full sequence, her expression professionally neutral, her jaw muscle working once near the end. "That is your equipment," she said. It was not a question. "Every piece of it. I have purchase records, serial numbers, and photographs from the last insurance assessment 18 months ago." I put the phone in my pocket. "I want a formal theft report filed. Felony theft, Montana Code 45-6-301. Combined value exceeds $45,000, which places it squarely in the felony range. The combined value exceeds $45,000. I have never signed any document authorizing the removal of that equipment from this property. Not once. Not for any reason." Callahan was already writing. I found Garrett at the edge of the orchard, standing with his back to the yard, staring at the apple trees his mother had planted. I walked up beside him and held the phone out without a word. He took it. He watched the footage. I watched him watch it. His breathing changed, first shallow and fast. The breathing of a man whose body understands something before his mind has finished processing it. Then his hand started shaking, a fine tremor that moved up through his wrist and into his forearm. When the footage ended, he lowered the phone slowly, like a man setting down something fragile. "Dad." His voice was wrecked. "I thought he was just clearing space. He said he'd put everything back before—" "Garrett." I kept my voice level, though it cost me. $45,000. Grand larceny carries up to 10 years in Montana. I am not filing that report against you today. I am filing it against the man who planned this. But the code that opened that gate came from your phone, and the hands that held that workshop door open were yours, and I need you to understand what that means for where you stand right now." He pressed his fist against his sternum like something inside him physically hurt. His eyes squeezed shut. "I know," he said. "I know, Dad." "No," I said. "You don't know yet. But you're going to." I took the phone back and walked toward Cassian, who was waiting with the county filing folder and the expression of a man who had been saving the worst for last. "Stop right here. Before I tell you what was inside that county filing, the thing that turned a Thanksgiving dispute into a criminal investigation, I need you to do one thing. Type 'I'm still here' in the comments. Because what comes next is the part of this story I almost did not believe myself when I found it. This story contains fictional elements added to bring the lesson to life more fully. If you prefer a different kind of content, this is a good moment to step away. No hard feelings. The first guests started leaving while I was still walking back to Cassian. I watched it happen the way you watch a tide go out, not all at once, but steadily, with a kind of inevitability that made the resistance of the few who stayed seem almost touching. A man in a gray blazer was arguing with Callahan's second unit near the driveway, jabbing his finger at his phone to show the transaction record, demanding to know who was going to refund his $300. Two women near the orchard fence were already on their phones calling for rides. The catering staff had stopped pretending to work and were quietly stacking equipment near their van. Garrick moved through the dissolving crowd with the strained energy of a man trying to hold water in his hands. He touched shoulders, spoke in low, urgent tones, smiled the smile that had stopped working an hour ago. Lavinia followed him, still in her red dress, the pearls at her throat catching the pale afternoon light. Her smile was gone now, fully gone, not flickering, just absent like a light that had been switched off at the breaker. I reached Cassian at the edge of the parking area. He opened the folder and handed me a document without ceremony. It was a zoning reclassification application submitted to Ravalli County in September, requesting conversion of the mill property from agricultural and light industrial use to commercial mixed use, specifically a boutique event venue and lodging development. The applicant was listed as Vanavort Property Holdings, LLC. I read the owner authorization section. The signature on the line marked property owner consent read Orson J. Braithwaite. I have signed my name approximately 40,000 times in my professional life. On inspection reports, on certification documents, on permit applications, on engineering assessments. I know my signature the way a musician knows their own instrument. The signature on that line was not mine. It was close enough to pass a casual review. But the pressure points were wrong, the terminal stroke on the B was wrong, and the J abbreviation was written in a way I have never written it in 68 years. My chest went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the November air. "How did you find this?" I asked. "Public records search on the property address," Cassian said. "I ran it this morning after you called me Wednesday night. Any filing associated with this address in the past 12 months. He paused. "Orson. Whoever signed that did not do it recently. That application was submitted in September. They have been planning this since at least summer." I handed the document to Callahan without speaking. She read the authorization section. She looked up at me. She looked at the signature. She looked back at me. "Is that your signature, Mr. Braithwaite?" "It is not." She wrote something in her notebook, underlined it, and wrote something else beneath it. Across the yard, I noticed a woman standing at the property line near the orchard fence on the public side of it, just beyond the gate where the access road met the shoulder of the county road. She was perhaps 35 years old, dark hair, wearing a coat that was good but not expensive. The coat of someone who had not paid $150 for a ticket to impress anyone. She had not come through the gate with the guests. She was not on her phone. She was not arguing with anyone. She was simply standing on public ground and watching with the particular quality of attention that I recognized from 38 years of working with people who were paid to observe and document. I considered walking over to her. Then I reconsidered. She was standing on public ground, the county road shoulder, not my property, which meant she had every legal right to be exactly where she was. She was not filming with a large camera. She was not shouting questions. She was observing the way a professional observes, and whatever she was there to document, she was going to document it, whether I spoke to her or not. A man in the middle of a trespass finding does not need his words on record with an unknown party. I left her where she was, I turned back to Cassian. "There's more," he said. He produced a second document, a quote for short-term rental liability insurance addressed to Vanavort Property Holdings, LLC, for a property described as a historic mill and event venue in Ravalli County. And beneath that, a printout of a vacation rental platform, listing that his investigator had captured before it was taken down 3 bedrooms, private orchard access event space, available $289 per night. The listing had gone live 11 days ago. No bookings had been confirmed yet. The first available dates were listed as January. The photographs in the listing were of my workshop, my orchard, my stone chimney. The interior of Marcella's kitchen, which appeared in the background of one image taken from the workshop doorway. I stood with those pages in my hands, and I thought about the summer. I thought about Garrett and Kendall coming out for a weekend in July, which I had been glad about, because it meant my son was spending time at a place his mother had loved. I thought about Garrett walking the property with his phone out the way young people always had their phones out, and how I had thought nothing of it. I thought about those photographs ending up in a rental listing for $289 a night. "Callahan," I said. My voice came out very quiet and very even. "What I am handing you now constitutes evidence of document forgery, a felony under Montana Code 45-6-325, and fraudulent commercial use of a property under a falsified owner authorization. I want everything I have just given you entered into the record." Callahan took the documents. She looked at them for a long moment. Then she looked at Garrick Vanavort, who was standing 20 feet away, watching us with the expression of a man who has just realized the hand he was playing was never going to be enough. Callahan walked toward Garrick with the documents in her hand, and I walked beside her. Garrick watched us cross the yard with the expression of a man trying to decide which version of himself was most useful. Right now, the jovial host, the aggrieved family member, the reasonable businessman. He had cycled through all 3 in the past 2 hours, and none of them had worked. But men like Garrick do not abandon a strategy simply because it has failed. They double down and adjust the angle. "Brenda." He spread his hands, the old warmth pushing back into his voice like water finding a crack. "Whatever Orson's shown you, I think we can sit down and talk through this like adults. There's clearly been some miscommunication between Mr. Vanavort." Callahan's voice had the quality of a door not just closing, but locking. "I need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you." She held up the zoning application and pointed to the owner authorization line. "This document was submitted to Ravalli County in September of this year. It bears a signature purporting to be that of Orson Braithwaite. Mr. Braithwaite has stated under record that this signature is not his." She paused. "Falsifying an owner's signature on a document submitted to a government agency is a felony under Montana Code 45-6-325. That is not a civil matter. That is a criminal matter that falls under the jurisdiction of the county prosecutor's office." The word felony hit Garrick differently than the word criminal had hit the crowd an hour ago. This crowd had reacted with social alarm, the instinct to avoid association. Garrick's reaction was physical. His color changed. The performance drained out of his face the way heat drains out of a room when a window breaks, and what was underneath was not the jovial host, or the aggrieved family member, or the reasonable businessman. It was a 65-year-old man who had overreached and was now doing the arithmetic on what that was going to cost him. "I don't know anything about a signature," he said. His voice had lost its warmth entirely. "I had someone handle the paperwork." "Who?" Callahan asked. He opened his mouth. Then he closed it. While Callahan continued with Garrick, I walked to the North Storage Building. I had my phone out, and my inspection eye fully engaged. 38 years of habit. Do not pause for personal circumstances. I unlocked the building and stepped inside. The propane tanks were exactly as I had found them earlier, 51 cylinders, in that same non-compliant configuration, the interior still warmer than it should have been. Behind them, along the back wall, was a crate I had not fully examined before. I opened it. 12 mortar tubes. Commercial-grade aerial fireworks, the kind that require a licensed pyrotechnics operator and a permit from the state fire marshal's office. No permit documentation anywhere in the building. I photographed everything. Every tank. Every mortar tube. The inadequate vent. The temperature differential I noted by pressing my palm to the interior wall versus the exterior. I documented it the way I had documented 1,000 hazardous conditions, flat, precise, nothing wasted. The mortar tubes changed the scope of what I had already reported. I stepped outside and called the fire marshal's office back, adding the 12 unlicensed aerial tubes to the record. They confirmed the inspector was still en route and told me to keep the building secured until he arrived. I walked back to where Cassian was standing and told him what I had found. "I'll attach the updated report to the civil file," he said. The inspection and penalty determination was theirs to make, not my call. But the documentation was mine, and it was solid. I looked across the yard. Most of the guests were gone now. The catering van was attempting to leave, and Callahan's second unit was in conversation with the driver about the inventory inside equipment that was currently subject to the property hold. Garrick stood near the gate with his arms crossed, staring at the ground, running calculations behind his eyes. Lavinia had moved away from him. That was the detail I noticed. In 8 years of knowing that woman, I had never seen her stand more than 10 feet from her husband at a social event. She was currently standing 30 feet away near the orchard fence, her arms wrapped around herself, her red dress a bright wrong note in the gray November afternoon. She was looking at Garrick. Not beside him, not with him. At him. The way you look at something you are deciding how to handle. My phone buzzed. Cassian touched my arm. "Orson," he said quietly. "Watch." Lavinia uncrossed her arms. She straightened her shoulders, and she walked toward Callahan. I have seen a lot of people decide to save themselves. In 38 years of inspections and depositions and boundary disputes, I have watched the moment arrive in a lot of different faces, the moment when a person does the arithmetic and concludes that loyalty is a luxury they can no longer afford. It never looks noble. It rarely looks calculated. Mostly it looks like fear wearing the clothes of honesty. I watched her cross the distance between herself and Callahan with the deliberate pace of a woman who had finished doing arithmetic and did not like the answer. Whatever arrangement she had entered into with her husband, the word felony had changed the calculation. Lavinia Vanavort was not a woman who went down with a ship when there was still a lifeboat available. She reached Callahan and squared her shoulders and spoke in a voice that was clear and carrying and entirely unlike the honeyed social tone she had used all afternoon. "I want to make something clear for your record," she said. "I was asked to organize a family gathering. That is what I understood this to be. I was not told about any rental listing. I was not told about any zoning application. And I was not told about any signature." She paused, and the pause had the quality of a blade being positioned. What I was told by Garrett was that his father was aging, that he no longer had use for the property, and that the family should make better use of it before it sat empty another year. The yard went very still. Garrett had been standing 12 feet away. I watched my son hear his name come out of his mother-in-law's mouth, attached to words he had never said, and I watched what it did to him. The color came out of his face, the way color comes out of wood left in the rain, not all at once, but steadily grain by grain, until what was left was something pale and stripped, That is not what I said. His voice shook, but it held. I said my father was grieving. I said he found it hard to come out here after my mother died. I did not say he had no use for it. Those are completely different statements. Lavinia turned to look at him with an expression I had never seen on her face in 8 years. Not warmth, not social calculation, not the performance of affection. Something flat and assessing the look of a woman deciding how much of a problem this particular person was going to be. Garrett, she said gently, the way you speak to someone you are about to disappoint. You need to think carefully about what you remember. Something broke open in my son's face. He took a step toward her, and his voice cracked down the middle like a branch under snow load. You told me this was a family dinner. You said Dad had agreed to let the property be used for the holidays. You said... He stopped. His hands came up and pressed against his temples, fingers digging in like a man trying to hold his own skull together. You used my key. You used my code. You put my name on a contract I never read. And now you're standing in front of a sheriff's deputy telling her it was my idea. Kendall crossed the yard in 5 fast strides. Garrett stopped talking. Don't. He turned on his... and his voice dropped to something that was almost quiet, almost controlled, and therefore more devastating than shouting would have been. Don't you tell me to stop talking. Not right now, not after this. Kendall's jaw tightened. Her eyes cut to her mother, then to her father, then back to Garrett. The fast triangulation of a person calculating where the safest position is in a collapsing structure. I trusted you, Garrett said to her. Not accusing, stating. The way you state a measurement you have just confirmed is wrong. I trusted your family. I gave them access to my father's property because I thought... His voice broke again, harder this time, and he pressed his fist against his mouth and breathed through his nose for a moment. I thought we were helping. Garrett stepped forward. Son. Do not call me that. Garrett's head came up. His eyes were red and wet and furious, and something else underneath, something I recognized because I had last seen it in a mirror 4 years ago, the morning after Marcella died. The specific, the hollow, stripped look of a person who has just understood that the world they thought they were living in does not exist. He turned and looked at me, not the guilty sideways look he had been giving me all afternoon. He looked at me directly, the way he had not looked at me in years, and his face was open in a way that had nothing performing in it. Dad, he said, I am sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't come close. But I need you to know I didn't understand what they were doing. I genuinely did not understand. I looked at my son for a long moment. Something pulled tight behind my ribs, the particular weight of loving someone who has caused you serious harm through serious foolishness, and knowing that the foolishness was real and the harm was real and the love was also real, and none of those 3 things canceled the others out. I know, I said. It was the only honest answer I had. I left Garrett standing in the orchard with his grief and walked back to where Cassian was waiting. There was one more thing to do before the day was finished, and Cassian had the paperwork for it already prepared, because Cassian Thorpe had been doing this kind of work for 31 years. And he understood that the moment after an emotional confrontation is precisely when the other side is most likely to make decisions based on feeling rather than calculation. That was when you locked the gate. I walked back to Callahan and made the request directly. The tent, the tables, the sound equipment, the catering setup, all of it arrived on property connected to an active trespass finding and a forgery investigation. I want it logged as potential evidence before anything leaves. Callahan looked at the gate. Then she looked at her second unit. Nobody moves equipment until we have a full inventory, she said loud enough for the catering staff to hear. She walked to the main gate herself and secured it. I'll note the time, she said. Garrick watched me put that padlock on his exit, and something moved through his face that was not quite panic and not quite fury. It was the expression of a man who had spent the afternoon believing he could talk his way out of this and had just understood definitively that the talking portion of the day was over. He crossed the yard toward me with his hands open at his sides. Not the expansive welcome gesture from this morning, but the careful open hands of a man trying to signal that he was not a threat, which is a very different thing. Orson. His voice was stripped of everything now. No warmth, no performance, just a 65-year-old man doing arithmetic. What do you need from me to end this today? I nodded to Cassian. Cassian opened his folder and produced a single document, 4 pages clean type, Cassian's firm letterhead at the top. He held it out to Garrick without extending the courtesy of a handshake. This is a demand for damages, Cassian said. Itemized. $15,000 for the restoration of one antique saw bench Tiger maple construction, circa 1920, damaged beyond normal use through unauthorized modification. $8,000 for the destruction of established orchard grounds. The vehicle traffic across your wife's apple trees has compacted the root zones on 11 trees that will require arborist intervention to assess. He turned the page. $30,000 representing the fair market rate for commercial use of a private event venue in Ravalli County for a 4-day period based on comparable venue pricing in the region. Total $53,000. Garrick's face went through several things in rapid succession, none of them good. That is absolutely. The number is documented and defensible, Cassian said. You are welcome to contest it in civil court. In the meantime, your equipment stays on this property until the matter is resolved, or until you make satisfactory arrangements with Deputy Callahan for supervised removal item by item. Lavinia, who had drifted close enough to hear, pressed her hand against her mouth. Her eyes went bright and sharp, with the particular shine that precedes tears in a person who is angry rather than sad. $53,000, she said to no one in particular. Her voice was hollow. Garrick. $53,000. Garrick did not look at her. He was looking at me with the expression I had seen in 100 boundary disputes, the expression of a man who had moved the line so gradually over so many seasons that he had genuinely stopped being able to see the original marker. Not innocent, not guilty. Somewhere in the complicated middle ground of a person who has convinced himself so thoroughly that the territory was his, that the legal correction feels like theft. You could have called me, he said. Any time in the past 2 years, Orson, you could have just called. I picked up the padlock key from my palm and put it in my shirt pocket. So could you, I said. I walked back to my truck. The sun was dropping behind the mountains, that particular Montana dusk that turns everything amber and then gray in the space of 20 minutes. I sat in the driver's seat and looked at the orchard, the apple trees Marcella had planted one by one root to root over the course of 5 autumns. 11 of them with compacted soil around their bases now. 11 trees she had named. I put the truck in gear and drove home in the dark. I did not sleep well. That is not a complaint, it is a data point. I have learned over 68 years to treat what happens in my body the same way I treat what happens in a structure I am assessing. Not good or bad, just information. And the information my body gave me that Thursday night was that I had been carrying something very heavy for a very long day, and the body does not simply set that down because the calendar says it is time to sleep. I lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the wind work its way through the pine stand, on the north side of the property. At some point, I gave up on sleep as a goal and started treating it as something that might arrive on its own if I stopped pursuing it, which is the only strategy I have ever found useful when the mind has decided it is not finished with the day. I went over the timeline in my head, not out of worry, but out of the same professional instinct that had made me review inspection notes after every difficult site visit across 4 decades of work. What had happened? What had been documented? What remained to be done? The answer to that last question was 2 things. Both of them could wait until morning. But morning came early. I was at the kitchen table by 5:30 with coffee and my phone and the email Cassian had sent at 11 the night before. Outside the kitchen window, the sky was that particular blue-black of a Montana winter pre-dawn, not quite night, not yet anything else, just the hour between. A deer had come into the yard at some point. I could see the hoof prints in the thin snow on the back step. Marcella used to leave apple cores out for them in winter. Old habit. I had continued it without deciding to. The attachment in Cassian's email was what I expected: a completed IRS Form 3949A, the standard reporting form for suspected tax violations, pre-filled with the transaction data from the Kendall VB Events LLC Venmo account. $9,000 in ticket revenue collected in a single day on a property she had no legal right to use under a business name that had no authorization to operate at that address, reported to neither the Internal Revenue Service nor the Montana Department of Revenue. $9,000. I sat with that number for a moment. One afternoon. One event. On land that had been in my name since the year my son was 4 years old. I read through the form twice, checking each field the way I used to check each line of a permit application before I signed it. Then I signed it electronically and sent it back to Cassian, who filed it with the IRS and the State Revenue Office before 8 o'clock. Cassian had also prepared a second form for the Montana Department of Revenue, which went in simultaneously. 2 forms. 15 minutes of work. The kind of thing that sits in a government inbox for weeks or months before anyone acts on it, but which, once filed, cannot be unfiled. That distinction mattered to me more than the timeline. The clock was running, and it would keep running whether anyone was looking at it or not. I refilled my coffee and sat back down. The kitchen was warm and quiet, the way it is at that hour when the furnace has been running, and the rest of the world has not yet started making noise. I sat with that quietness for a few minutes, and did not try to fill it. Some mornings the right thing to do is nothing at all, and this was one of them. My phone rang at 7:43. Petra Hollis. Orson. Her voice had that particular texture of someone who has just read something surprising over breakfast, not alarmed, but recalibrated the way a person sounds when the world has rearranged itself slightly in the time it took to drink a first cup of coffee. "Have you looked at the paper this morning?" "Not yet." "You should." A pause. The Raleigh Republic. Front page of the local section. I pulled it up on my phone. The headline read, "Thanksgiving Gala at Historic Mill Ends with Deputies Trespass Notice." The byline was Nadia Flores, staff reporter. The woman in the practical coat who had not left with the others. I had noticed her standing near the orchard fence while everyone else was moving toward the parking area. Noticed her the way you notice something that does not fit the pattern of its surroundings without knowing yet why it does not fit. Now I knew. The article was careful and factual. In the way that good local journalism is careful and factual, it named the property, described the event, reported the presence of law enforcement, and quoted 3 attendees who had agreed to speak on the condition of anonymity. One described paying $150 per ticket for what turned out to be an event on private property that was shut down by police. Another said they had been told the venue was a historic family estate available for private events. A third said they were still waiting to hear about refunds. There was a detail in the second paragraph that stopped me. Nadia Flores had done her background research. She had pulled the property records, found the deed noted that the mill had been established by Marcella Braithwaite in the mid-90s and had operated as a working woodcraft studio and orchard for nearly 2 decades before her death. The article called it a historic property. That word, historic, sat in my chest in a way I had not anticipated. Marcella would have laughed at it. She would have said a thing is not historic just because it is old. But she would have been pleased. The photographs had been taken from the public road at the property entrance. The banner visible through the gate. The string lights still glowing in the background. She must have arrived early and shot before the power went out, then stayed to observe the rest from the road. A good reporter knows when to wait. Nothing that required being on the property. Everything that told the story. The final paragraph read, "The property owner, Orson Braithwaite, a retired structural and fire safety engineer with 38 years of professional experience in Ravalli County, declined to comment for this article." I had not declined to comment. I simply had not known I was being observed by a reporter. But the description was accurate enough, and declining to comment was on reflection exactly what I would have chosen to do. You do not need to speak to a reporter when the deputy's report and the county filing and the Venmo receipts are already speaking on your behalf. "The whole county is reading this," Petra said. The old habit she sometimes slipped into the phrase that way, the cadence of someone who had lived in this county long enough to know how fast news moved through it and how thoroughly. "The Vanavorts have been calling people since last night. Garrick left a voicemail for the Hendersons. You know the Hendersons on Clearwater trying to explain that it was a private family matter that got out of hand. I imagine he's making a lot of calls," I said. "He is." A pause. "Are you all right?" Not the social version of the question. The real one, the way she had asked it after Marcella's funeral, standing in my kitchen with a casserole dish, and the particular directness of a woman who had known us both for 20 years and had decided that directness was the only courtesy that situation deserved. Petra Hollis had never once asked me how I was doing when she meant something else. It was one of the things I valued most about her. I thought about it honestly before I answered. "I'm tired," I said. "But I'm all right. How are the trees on the north side of the fence?" A beat of quiet, then a sound that was almost a laugh. The sound of a person who has just heard someone they care about do the very thing that is most like them. "Still standing," she said. "I'll check the root zones this weekend." "I'd appreciate that." We hung up. I sat with the coffee and the quiet of the house, and let myself feel the tiredness for a moment. Not wallow in it, just acknowledge it, the way you acknowledge a load-bearing element that has been under sustained stress. It had held. The structure had held. That was not nothing. Then my phone buzzed. A number I did not recognize. I let it ring through to voicemail. The message was 40 seconds long. Garrick Vanavort's voice, stripped of every social grace he had ever deployed. The warmth, the expansiveness, the practiced ease of a man who had spent 40 years getting other people to like him down to something that was almost human in its plainness. Almost. "Orson, it's Garrick. I know you don't want to hear from me. I know I don't have any ground to stand on right now. I need you to know that I didn't think it would go this far." I thought. A pause. The sound of a man reorganizing what he had planned to say, finding that what he had planned to say was not adequate to the situation. I thought the place was just sitting there. I thought eventually it would come to the family anyway, and I was moving ahead of the schedule is all. I know that's not how you see it. I know. Another pause longer than the first. Call me back. Please. Moving ahead of the schedule, I listened to it once. I sat with it for a moment. Not with anger, the anger had settled into something quieter and more durable over the past 12 hours, but with the particular attention I gave to any piece of evidence that told me something true about a situation. And that voicemail told me something true. Not about Garrick's remorse, which I did not trust, but about his understanding of what he had done. He had not believed he was stealing. He had believed he was early. That was a distinction that mattered. It did not change anything, but it mattered. I forwarded the voicemail to Cassian with a single line, "Add this to the file." He replied within the hour. The voicemail would not establish criminal liability on its own, he said, but it established intent, and intent was the thing a civil case was built on. Then I got up, rinsed my coffee cup, and went to get ready for the day. I did not return Garrick's call. Not Friday, not the weekend. After forwarding his voicemail to Cassian Friday morning, I put the phone face down on the kitchen counter and left it there until Saturday. The weekend was quiet. In the way that December weekends in Ravalli County are quiet, the kind of stillness that settles over a rural property when the snow is thick enough and the temperature low enough that even the birds have decided to stay wherever they are. I split wood on Saturday afternoon because splitting wood is one of the few tasks I know of that requires enough physical attention to prevent a man from thinking too hard about things he cannot yet resolve. By Sunday evening, I had more wood than I needed for the rest of the winter, and my shoulders ached, and I slept better than I had since Thanksgiving. Monday morning, I put on the navy sport coat that Marcella had bought me for our 35th anniversary. I do not know why I reached for it specifically. It had been hanging in the same spot in the closet for 4 years, and I had put it on perhaps twice since she died, once for a funeral, once for a county planning meeting that turned out not to warrant it. But that morning, I stood in front of the closet, and my hand went to it without deliberation, the way your hand goes to something that feels right before your brain has finished explaining why. I put it on. I looked at myself in the mirror for a moment. The coat still fit. Marcella had always had a good eye for those things. I drove to Cassian's office on the main street of Hamilton. His office smelled the way it had smelled for 25 years, old paper and coffee, and the particular dry warmth of a building that has good insulation and is heated by a boiler that knows what it is doing. His paralegal, a woman named Sandra, who had worked for Cassian for 18 years, and who greeted me the way you greet someone whose name you have typed on documents for 2 decades, nodded me through without a word. Cassian was already at his desk with 2 cups of coffee and a document folder, and the expression of a man who had been thinking about this particular meeting since Thursday evening. He did not ask how I was. In 30 years of friendship, that is one of the things I have most valued about him. He understands when a question is a formality and when it is genuine, and he does not waste the genuine ones on mornings when the answer is obvious. He slid the folder across the desk without preamble. I opened it. The document was 4 pages, clean and precise, the way Cassian's work always was. No flourishes, no ambiguity, every phrase chosen, because it said exactly one thing and nothing else. A formal amendment to the Braithwaite Family Living Trust, executed under Montana trust law. The amendment removed Garrett James Braithwaite as a named beneficiary in all provisions of the trust. In his place, the entirety of the estate would pass to the Marcella Braithwaite Engineering Scholarship Fund, to be administered by Ravalli County Community Foundation for the benefit of engineering students in the county. I read every word. I read it the way I used to read inspection reports that I had written myself before signing them, looking for the place where the language left room for something I did not intend, finding none. Cassian let me read without speaking, which was one of the things I had valued about him for 30 years. When I finished, I set the document down and looked at the window. Outside Hamilton's main street was doing what small Montana towns do in December, moving slowly, people in heavy coats, a truck idling at the curb with exhaust rising in the cold air, a woman wrestling a large wrapped package through the door of the hardware store with the particular determination of someone who has decided she is not going to ask for help. December in a small town. Marcella had loved December here. She said it was the only month where everyone moved at the same speed. Cassian, I said, I need you to understand something before I sign this. Tell me, I am not doing this because I have stopped loving my son. My voice came out steadier than I expected, which surprised me, and which I was grateful for. I am doing this because he needs to understand that choices have consequences that outlast the apology. If I sign this, and then quietly undo it 6 months from now because he said the right things, then this document means nothing and he learns nothing. I picked up the pen and held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it. I am signing this because I love him, not in spite of it. Cassian looked at me over his glasses for a long moment. The office was very quiet. Outside, a truck downshifted on the main street, and the sound of it came through the old walls and then faded. I know, he said, which was what I had said to Garrett 2 days ago in the yard of the mill, and hearing it back in that quiet office in Cassian's voice did something to my sternum that I was not entirely prepared for. I pressed my lips together and looked back at the document and signed my name, set the pen down, closed the folder. I did not feel relieved. I did not feel satisfied. I felt the way I feel when I have correctly identified a structural failure and written it into the record, certain that what I have done is right and aware that being right about a difficult thing does not make the thing less difficult. There's news, Cassian said. He had spoken to a contact in the county over the weekend. Garrick had been making calls not just to social acquaintances trying to manage the story, but to Kendall directly. Kendall had since spoken to a mutual acquaintance, and the account had made its way to Cassian's investigator before Monday. The conversation, as it had been described, had been blunt in the way that Garrick was blunt when the performance was no longer useful. He had told his daughter to end her marriage, not suggested, told. The man who had spent 7 years positioning his family into the orbit of the Braithwaite property had looked at what that positioning had produced: a felony forgery investigation, a $53,000 demand, an IRS referral, and a story on the front page of the local paper, and had concluded that Garrett was a liability rather than an asset. The asset had not materialized. The liability was considerable. The calculation was for a man like Garrick entirely straightforward. The words he had reportedly used were that man could not deliver 1 inch of ground. I sat with that for a moment. Not with anger. The anger had done its work in the week since Thanksgiving, and what remained was something flatter and sadder. 7 years. My son had spent 7 years in a marriage that his father-in-law had viewed from the beginning as a real estate transaction. Garrett had brought his whole self to that marriage, his loyalty, his willingness to please, the particular softness in him that I had sometimes found frustrating, and that Marcella had always said was the best thing about him, and the man on the other side of the table had been looking at the deed the entire time. When the transaction failed, the father-in-law had moved to cut his losses with the same cold efficiency he would have applied to any other deal that had gone wrong. "Does Garrett know?" I asked. "I don't know," Cassian said. "But he will. These things move fast in a small county." I stood up and put on my coat. The tiredness from the past week was still with me, not sharp, just present the way an old structural repair holds the memory of the test in every drop in temperature. Cassian. I picked up my gloves from the arm of the chair. "If Garrett comes to you, if he needs anything legally while this is sorting itself out, I want you to help him. Whatever he needs, bill me separately." He doesn't need to know. Cassian looked at me the way he had looked at me for 30 years across a chessboard, the look of a man who has just seen a move he did not anticipate, but immediately recognizes as correct. "Done," he said. I walked out into the December cold and got into my truck and sat there for a moment with my hands on the wheel looking at the street. The woman with the wrapped package was still fighting with the hardware store door, and this time a teenage boy held it open for her, and she thanked him with the particular effusiveness of someone whose arms have been full for too long. Somewhere across town, my son was about to find out that the family he had chosen over his own father had just chosen to discard him. There was nothing I could do about that. There was nothing I should do about that. Some lessons arrive on their own schedule in their own way, and the kindest thing a father can do is make sure the door is not locked when his son finally comes home. I started the truck and drove. The call from Callahan came at 4 in the afternoon on a Thursday. "Your equipment is back," she said. "All of it." Garrick Vanavort hired a flatbed and a crew this morning. We had 2 units on site for the inventory check. Every serial number matches your insurance assessment. Nothing missing, nothing visibly damaged. I signed off on the return at 2:45. A pause. "He paid for the transport himself." I thanked her and hung up. I drove out to the mill to check the equipment personally, not because I doubted Callahan's inventory, but because some things a man needs to see with his own eyes before he can put them down. The table saw was back in its position. The planer, the CNC router with the small scratch on the left rail that I had made myself the first week I owned it. The pneumatic cabinets. All of it returned with the careful precision of a man who understood that the alternative was a felony charge and a court date in front of a judge who played chess on Friday nights with his attorney. I stood in the workshop for a while. It still smelled like catering. That would take time to clear. Then I drove home. Garrett's truck was parked in front of my house at 8 o'clock that evening. Not in the driveway at the curb the way you park, when you are not sure you have the right to pull in. He was sitting in the driver's seat with the engine off. He had been there long enough that the windows had started to fog from the inside. I parked in the driveway and got out. He got out at the same moment, and we stood in the December cold on either side of the yard, looking at each other, our breath coming out in small white clouds in the porch light. He looked like he had not slept properly in 2 weeks. There were shadows under his eyes that had not been there at Thanksgiving, and something in his posture had changed. The careful social ease he had been carrying for years was gone, and what was underneath was something younger and more uncertain, and I thought more honest. "I didn't know if you'd want me here," he said. "I left the porch light on," I said. "Come inside. I made coffee." He sat at the kitchen table in the same chair he had sat in for 30 years of meals, and he wrapped both hands around the mug I put in front of him, like a man holding on to something he was afraid might be taken away. I did not let him settle into the warmth of the kitchen before I told him. It would have been easier to wait, but easy was not what this moment needed. "The trust amendment," I said. "I signed it Monday. Cassian has the file." He nodded once slowly, the way a man nods when he has already prepared himself for the thing that has just arrived. "I figured," he said quietly. "I figured you had." "Kendall asked me to leave," he said. "Last weekend. Her father called her Friday morning, and by Saturday night I was packing a bag." He stared into the coffee. "I keep trying to figure out when it stopped being a marriage and started being something else, and I can't find the line. It moved so gradually I didn't see it moving." Something in my chest recognized that. Deeply and specifically recognized it. Those are the lines that cost the most," I said. "The ones that moved while you were looking somewhere else." He looked up at me. His eyes were red at the rims, and his jaw was tight with the effort of holding himself together at the kitchen table where he had cried exactly once before at the age of 9 when his dog died, and he had not wanted to cry in front of anyone but had not been able to help it. Dad. His voice cracked on the word, and he pressed on through it. What I did, giving them the code, signing that contract, without reading it, letting them use this family's name and this family's property to run a scheme I didn't fully understand, but should have. I don't have a good excuse for any of it. I have reasons, but reasons aren't excuses, and I know the difference. I let that sit for a moment. It deserved to sit. The bravest thing you did on Thanksgiving, I told him, was not the apology. It was when you stood up to your mother-in-law in front of everyone and told her she was lying about what you said. You did that in front of people who had power over you, and it cost you something real. I want you to know I saw it. Garrett's throat worked. He pressed his lips together hard and stared at the ceiling for a moment, blinking fast. When he looked back down, his eyes were wet, but his voice was steadier. Dale called me last week, he said. He asked if I wanted to come help with the saw bench. I know, I said. He told me. I went on Saturday. I did the finish sanding on the top surface. He looked at his hands, the fine pale dust still visible in the creases of his knuckles, if you knew to look for it. It's beautiful, Dad. The wood underneath all the damage, it's still beautiful. My throat tightened in a way I had not expected. I picked up my coffee and looked at the window above the sink, giving myself a moment the way I had given myself a moment in the workshop on Thanksgiving, facing a bare hook on an empty pegboard. It can be changed, I said. But not tonight. And not because you came here and said the right things. It gets changed when I see something different over time. When the man sitting in that chair makes different choices than the man who stood in my workshop and held a door open while someone loaded my equipment into a truck. He held my gaze. His eyes were steady now, steadier than I had seen them in years. Okay, he said. Just that. Not a negotiation, not a promise wrapped in performance. Just a single word that meant he had heard me. We sat at that table for another hour. We talked about Marcella, about things I had not talked about with anyone since she died. Small things, the way she hummed when she worked the particular coffee she liked, that they stopped making in 2019 and she had never quite forgiven. Garrett laughed at that. A real laugh, sudden and warm, the laugh of a boy who remembered his mother clearly enough to find her stubbornness funny even now. When he stood to go, I walked him to the door. The mill, he said on the porch. After the new year, when things have settled, can I come out and help with whatever needs doing? I looked at my son in the porch light in the December cold, with sawdust still in the creases of his hands. Call first, I said. He nodded and walked to his truck and drove away. I stood on the porch until his taillights disappeared around the bend. Then I went inside, washed both coffee cups, and turned off the porch light. The smoke was the first thing I saw. I came around the last bend on the access road at 7:40 in the morning, and there it was, a thin gray thread rising from the workshop chimney into the pale December sky, straight and clean, the way wood smoke goes when the air is cold and still, and there is no wind to pull it sideways. I had not seen smoke from that chimney since the winter Marcella died. She used to light the stove when she worked in cold weather. Said it made the shop feel inhabited rather than just occupied. I sat in the truck for a moment looking at it. Then I parked and went inside. Dale Hutchins was crouched in front of the stove feeding it a piece of split pine when I pushed open the workshop door. He looked up with the unhurried expression of a man who had been expecting me and had decided I would arrive when I arrived. 2 other men were in the room. Walt Calhoun and Pete Dietrich, both retired Finnish carpenters who had worked alongside Dale and Marcella in the early years of the mill. Walt was 73 and moved carefully these days, but his hands on a piece of wood were still the steadiest I had ever seen. Pete was 68, same as me, and had brought a thermos of something that smelled considerably stronger than coffee. The saw bench was in the center of the room. I stopped walking when I saw it. Dale had found quarter-sawn white oak for the replacement legs, not identical to the original tiger maple, but a wood with enough age and character to hold its own beside the original top. He had turned each leg on his lathe to match the profile of the surviving original, the one leg they had not needed to cut, measuring it with calipers until the replication was within a tolerance that would have satisfied any inspector I had ever worked with. The bolt holes from the chafing dish brackets had been filled with wooden plugs, hand-fitted and flush-sanded, until you had to know they were there to find them. The top surface had been stripped back to bare wood, all the ring stains, all the gouge from the extension cord channel, all of it taken down and refinished in 3 coats of the same tung oil finish Marcella had used, the same amber that had lived in this shop for 30 years. It was not perfect. Dale had told me it would not be perfect, and he had been right. The legs were oak where they had been maple. The plugged holes were there if you looked for them. The finish was new where the original had been old, but the bench was standing. It was standing in its own place under the window where Marcella had always kept it in the shop that she had built, and it was whole. I put my hand on the top surface. The wood was warm from the stove. My throat closed entirely, and I stood there with my hand on that bench for a long moment, not speaking, not performing, just present in the way you can only be present in a place that has cost you something real. "Well," Dale said from behind me, "don't just stand there being sentimental. There's food." I laughed. It came out rougher than I intended, and I cleared my throat twice and turned around, and Dale was grinning at me with the grin of a man who has known you long enough to know that sometimes the kindest thing is to make you laugh before you do something embarrassing. Petra Hollis arrived at 8:30 with 2 wooden crates of apples from the orchard's cold storage, the last of the autumn harvest, the heirloom varieties that Marcella had brought from that Oregon nursery in 1995. She set them on the saw bench, without asking whether that was the right place for them, because she had known Marcella long enough to know that it was exactly the right place. The color of those apples on that refinished wood, the deep red and gold of them against the amber of the tung oil, was something I did not have words for, and did not try to find words for. The root zones on the 11 trees look manageable, Petra told me, pulling off her gloves and accepting a mug of coffee from Walt. "I had a soil guy out on Tuesday. He says with proper aeration and a good spring feeding, we should not lose any of them." "Tell me what it costs," I said. "I already handled it," she said in the tone that meant the conversation was over, which was a tone I had learned not to argue with in 22 years of knowing Petra Hollis. Cassian arrived at 9 in the good overcoat he reserved for occasions he had decided mattered. He shook hands with Dale and Walt, and Pete accepted a cup from Pete's thermos with slightly more caution than the others, and then stood beside me looking at the bench with the apple crates on it, and the stove going and the morning light coming through the workshop windows the way it always had. "Harlan Webb sends his regards," he said. "He's been county prosecutor for 12 years, and he reviewed the forgery case file last week as a courtesy. He says his office is taking it seriously." "Good," I said. "Also," Cassian reached into his coat pocket and produced an envelope. "Cashier's check. Arrived at my office Wednesday. No cover letter, no note." He handed it to me. The amount on the check was $53,000. The remitter line read, "Vanavort Property Holdings, LLC." I looked at it for a moment. Then I folded it and put it in my shirt pocket. "I'll deposit it Monday," I said. Deputy Callahan came at 10, with her patrol partner, both of them officially off shift and in civilian clothes, which I appreciated because it meant they had come as people, rather than as law enforcement, which was a distinction that mattered to me. She brought a pie huckleberry from the bakery on Main Street that had been there since 1987. She set it on the workbench next to the apple crates and looked around the workshop with the assessing eye of someone who had stood in this room under very different circumstances 3 weeks ago. "It looks right," she said. "It does," I agreed. We ate around the saw bench. Dale's wife had sent cold fried chicken and biscuits. Petra had brought a pot of something that turned out to be the best white bean soup I had eaten since Marcella made it, and Pete's thermos turned out to contain a hot cider situation that nobody examined too closely. Walt told a story about the first time he and Dale had helped Marcella move the saw bench into the shop sometime in the mid-90s, once the workshop was finally ready for it, involving a bad ramp, a wheel that came off, and language that Dale claimed he did not remember using. Callahan laughed so hard, she had to set her plate down. Outside, snow had begun to fall. Real December snow, not the thin early-season dusting, but the steady, committed snowfall that means winter has arrived and intends to stay. It came down past the workshop windows, in slow diagonals covering the yard, softening the outline of the orchard, settling into the compacted soil around the apple trees that Marcella had planted one by one over 5 autumns. The sign above the workshop door read, "Marcella Braithwaite." Dale had rehung it the first week without being asked, with new hardware and a fresh coat of weatherproof varnish. It would outlast all of us. Late in the afternoon, when the food was mostly gone and the conversation had settled into the comfortable quietness of people who have known each other long enough that silence between them is not empty, Dale came and stood beside me at the window. "You going to stay a while after we go?" he asked. "I think so," I said. He nodded. He put his hand briefly on my shoulder. Not a performance, just the gesture of a man who had known me for 25 years and knew when words were not the right tool for the job. "She'd have liked today," he said. "I know," I said. We stood there at the window, watching the snow come down over the orchard until the light started to go, and then the others began pulling on their coats, and the workshop slowly, warmly, quietly emptied out. When the last set of taillights disappeared down the access road, I closed the workshop door and stood in the quiet. The stove was still going. Dale had loaded it well before he left, the way a man does when he knows someone is staying behind and wants to make sure they stay warm. The overhead lights were off. The only light in the room came from the stove's air vent, a narrow orange line low on the wall, and from the single work lamp I had switched on above the saw bench. The bench sat in that circle of light, with the apple crates still on it, and the room smelled of wood and tung oil and the faint ghost of Petra's white bean soup. I pulled a stool over and sat down in front of it. "I have talked to Marcella since she died. I want to be straightforward about that because I am a man who spent 38 years dealing in verifiable facts, and I am aware of what it sounds like. But grief does not particularly care what sounds rational, and the workshop was the place she was most herself. And sitting in it alone in the evening with the stove going is about as close as I have found to the feeling of her being in the room. So I talk. And I do not apologize for it." "Well," I said, "it has been a month." The stove ticked. The snow was still coming down outside. I could hear it, or thought I could, the particular hush that falls over a Montana property when the snow is thick enough to start absorbing sound. I told her about Thanksgiving. All of it in order, the way I would have told her anything sitting at the kitchen table or on the porch or driving back from the hardware store in Hamilton. I told her about the banner across her gateposts and the sign where her name used to be. I told her about the saw bench, and about Dale saying her name in the doorway, and about having to turn away and look at an empty pegboard until I had myself back. I told her about Garrett, about the footage on the camera, and the code on his phone, and the contract he had signed without reading, and about the kitchen table 2 weeks later, and the sawdust in the creases of his hands. I left the door open, I said. I think you would have wanted me to. I think you always understood him better than I did, the ways he was like me, and the ways those ways got him into trouble. I stopped. I signed the document, the trust amendment. I know that's hard to hear, but I signed it the way I signed an inspection report, not with anger, just with accuracy. This is what the structure is. This is what needs to happen for it to be sound. The apple crates caught the lamplight on their upper edges. Marcella's trees. The heirlooms she had driven to Oregon for, loaded into the back of our truck, named one by one as they went into the ground over 5 autumns. 11 of them with compacted soil around their roots that would need tending in the spring. But standing. All of them still standing. I put my hand on the saw bench top, the refinished surface warm from the lamp above it. The repair was there if you looked for it. The plugged bolt holes, the oak legs that were not quite maple. But the thing itself was intact. The thing Marcella had looked at in a second-hand shop in Missoula in 1987 and said needed to come home, that thing was still here. I understand now, I said, what you meant about it needing to come home. I pressed my palm flat against the wood. You weren't talking about the bench. Outside, the snow came down over the orchard. Inside, the stove burned steady and orange and warm. I want to talk to you now, not to Marcella, but to you, whoever you are, wherever you are listening to this. Because I promised when I started that I would be straight with you. And there is one more thing left to say. 38 years of inspections taught me that the most dangerous damage is never the dramatic failure, the collapsed roof, the fallen wall, the thing that announces itself loudly and demands immediate attention. The most dangerous damage is the thing that moves slowly, the crack that widens by 1 millimeter each winter, the boundary that shifts by 6 feet each summer. The relationship where someone has been helping themselves to a little more than they were offered season by season, and nobody said anything because it seemed too small to address. Until one morning you arrive and find a banner across your gate that has been professionally printed with someone else's name on it. That is not a story about a bad man. Garrick Vanavort is not a monster. He is a man who spent his life working other people's land, standing in other people's workshops, building other people's docks, and when his daughter married into a family with property, he decided that proximity was the same as ownership. He moved the line the way people move lines, gradually, and then all at once. And I let him move it for 4 years, because I thought the friction wasn't worth it. That part is on me. I want to be clear about that. So here is what I would ask of you. Not as a lesson written on a card, but as the one practical thing I know from 68 years of living and 38 years of writing inspection reports. When someone in your life begins helping themselves to a little more than they were offered, your time, your space, your tools, your trust, your property, say something. Once. Early. In writing if you can. Not a confrontation, not a speech, not a legal letter, just a sentence. A clear, friendly written sentence that resets the clock and establishes the record. Because a phone call is a memory and a text message is a document. And I worked in the difference between those two things for 38 years. I sat with the bench for another while after that, until the stove began to drop and the cold started coming back into the edges of the room. Then I stood put on my coat, turned off the work lamp. The workshop went dark except for the orange glow of the stove vent. I walked to the door. I stopped with my hand on the latch and looked back at the saw bench in that faint, warm light. The apple crates, the refinished surface. The sign above the door that read Marcella Braithwaite in letters that would outlast every piece of paper I had filed this month. "Good night," I said. I stepped outside into the snow, locked the door with the new code. 3 people in the world knew it, and I knew all 3 of them. Walked to my truck, sat for a moment looking at the workshop, at the thin thread of smoke still rising from the chimney into the dark December sky. Then I drove home. If this reached you, I am glad. Comment 1 if you think I handled it right. Staying in the truck, calling the law, keeping it out of a shouting match in my own yard. Comment 2. If you think I should have gotten out of that truck and handled it differently, man to man, regardless of what the paperwork says. Comment 3. If right now tonight you are thinking of someone in your own life who has been moving the line a little further every season and you have not said anything yet. I read everyone, and I will tell you comment 3 is the one I most want to hear about. Because I let 4 years go by, and it cost me a printed banner across my wife's gateposts and a stranger's name where hers used to be. Don't let it get that far. Looking back on everything, the banner across Marcella's gate, the cedar sign where her name used to be, the saw bench sawed off at the knee. I keep returning to the same question. How many seasons did I let go by without saying one word? 4 years. That is my honest answer. I believe God gives every man what he needs to protect what he loves. The question is whether he uses it in time. This is what family justice truly looks like, not a shouting match, not a courtroom. It is a folder of documents, a call made from inside a truck, and the patience to let the truth speak louder than anger ever could. These are the dad's revenge stories nobody plans to live. But the ones worth telling always end the same way, with a man who was willing to be patient, to be documented, and to let the truth do what anger never could. Stories like these exist, so you do not have to learn this lesson the hard way. If this reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below. Tell me where you are in the world tonight. And if you believe in protecting what matters, subscribe and stay with us. Thank you for being here until the very last word. Upcoming stories contain fictional elements created for reflection and education. If that is not what you are looking for, we understand. Find what serves you best.